Melissa's been an A&R agent with UGA Cooperative Extension since January of 2016. And after working for 2 years in Union and Towns County, which she lets us know, and I'm incredibly jealous that is Georgia's official wine country. She transferred to Fulton County, and she has obtained her bachelor's and her master's degrees in entomology from the University of Georgia. Her current programming focuses on green industry safety, small-scale organic agriculture, and pest management. Now, welcome, Melissa, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I feel like I have to say this with every presentation, but I have a disclaimer that they are emptying the dumpsters at the shopping complex behind me. So I'm very sorry about any extraneous noise. But that's exactly why we're not on my porch today. It's not as nice of an environment as it usually is. All right, so we are viewing my PowerPoint. Hey, Rich, can you verify that we can see my presentation?
We sure can. It looks great.
Okay, awesome. Thank y'all so much. A lot of people asked all at once if archives are going to be available. Yes, they are. They're posted to our YouTube channel and our Facebook, and they will also be emailed out to everybody. We'll have links and some other additional information as well. There will also be a survey at the end of this. If y'all would please fill that out. This is going to be different than the other surveys because this is our last installment of this container gardening series. Would also like to extend a big thank you to our IT team, Richie and Beth that you've seen, and then Ashley Brantley, who has partnered with us down in Muskogee County and who gave the vegetable talk last week. So really big team effort here. Very, very happy y'all have all joined. So the last two talks, herbs and vegetables, have been very planting based and harvesting and things like that. This one's gonna be a little bit more artsy. So this is where you kind of get your creative juices flowing. We're going to learn a bit of design principle, color theory, all sorts of different things like that, as well as just specific type of ornamental flowers that are good for gardening in containers. So let's go ahead and get started. So some of this is going to be review if you've tuned into previous webinars that we've done on this. But a container garden, by definition, can include all sizes and shapes of containers. They're usually sitting on the ground. Sometimes they're elevated on stands or railings. They can be as small as a mason jar, or they can be as large as a big wine barrel or bigger. They can hold all types of plants, from succulents to perennial woody shrubs like roses, and even bulbs and other perennials like daffodils and dahlias and tulips and all sorts of things. Now, when we're talking about ornamental gardens, you typically see two different types that are beyond just container gardens. There are color bowls, which are small, usually pretty rounded, compact containers containing a diversity of plants. They're usually meant to accent something else in a room or outdoors. This is a great use for succulents. Most succulent gardens you see are a type of color bowl, because they can be very colorful themselves. And then combination baskets, which we're going to talk a little bit more at length about. These are typically hanging baskets that are usually going to have mounding and trailing plants, but nothing really tall and upright. And if you're not sure what mounding and trailing plants are, we're going to define that later. But there's not really too much of an element of height to these because they're usually pretty high up anyway. So the concept of an ornamental container garden, beyond just a plant in a container, is it applies the same landscape design principles as you would in an in-ground garden, with the added benefit that you get kind of creative expression through the container you choose as well. Also helps with preventing weeds. It's a nice compact art piece, so a lot of benefits. Large pots, the larger your pot, the more you can fit, and the more diversity you can have, the more interesting you can make it. course, the larger your pot, the less mobile it is. So you want to plant some pretty hardy plants in there. Any type of artistic technique, you can paint your pots, you can reuse large pots. I mentioned that wine barrel idea. And they can be very, very dynamic. If you do have kind of a medium size, you can move the containers around, change out your plants. If you plant a mix of annual and perennials, if you get tired of a plant, just change it out, things like that. So I mentioned we're going to get a little bit more artsy, and this is the start of that. So with design principles, there are 6 main principles that you want to keep in mind. And this may seem daunting, but it's actually pretty straightforward. And anytime you look at something and you think, oh gosh, I really like that, it's because it executes this well. So these are important concepts to have in mind. The first is focus, where you want the eye drawn to, balance, form and texture, which are more plant specific, and then rhythm and proportion, which refer to the entire container garden and the entire planting within that container. So let's break this down a little bit more. So when we look at this ornamental container garden, and there is going to be a bit of an overlap from our previous talks with vegetables and herbs, because you can make pretty much anything ornamental. I want you to look at this and see where your eye is drawn. Because for me, my eye is drawn right to the middle at that variegated sage. When we say variegated, that means multiple colors. So that sage in the middle, in kind of a tumult of different textures and colors, it provides a uniform consistency to the center of this piece. It grounds it. So this is what we mean by focus. As your eyes move around, I'm looking at those petunias, I'm looking at that grass up higher, I'm looking at the white verbena. But when my eyes get tired of looking at all that stuff, they come back to rest at that focal point. So this is what you want in the center of your arrangement. Of course, a lot of this can be very subjective. We're teaching you the basics and you can play around with them as you will. Because once you understand these concepts, you can kind of push them to their limits as well. But focus is probably one of the most basic ones that you really need to understand. What do people want to look at? What do you want everyone to see? What is the impact of that ornamental container that you want to present? There's also balance. Balance can really help with the feel that you're trying to convey with your container. And you can achieve it either symmetrically or asymmetrically. So on the left is a very symmetrical bowl. So you'll see there's the same amount of planting material on all sides. It's kind of hard to see here. It looks like the sweet potato is trailing down a little bit more, but it's actually trailing down equally on the other side. So if you were to turn it, it's all very similar. It's very, very balanced. If you were to cut it in half, it would look the same. But there's also balance to be achieved asymmetrically. And here we have a rather large cement container, and we've got a bunch of different textures there. We've got the trailing ivy down at the bottom left, which is going to draw your eyes downwards. But to set that off, there's a tall begonia up to the upper right. And so even though it's not quite symmetrical, we've got some things that are up and down and kind of out to the side. The major focal points of it, the major kind of offshoots of it are still balancing each other. So that's what we mean by an asymmetrical container. If you cut this in half, the halves would not be identical, but it's still balanced. It's not unsettling to look at. Form is another example of a principle, and this is where we refer to actual individual plants and their growth habit. So when I say something is trailing, that's going to be your ivies, your verbenas. Think of it trailing along the ground or spilling out over the edge like a waterfall. They're leggier, they're going to crawl along. Thyme is a great example of a trailing herb that can be used to hang over the edge and give that waterfall appearance. There's also mounding, which is just basically a standard plant form. A lot of the plants in the left-hand container, especially the purple and greenish, they are mounding plants. They have kind of a rounded shape. They really help to round out and give a horizon to your container. It kind of gives the border to it, even though you may have daisies or echinacea shooting off one way or another. It gives kind of an orbit to it. It gives the overall shape to the container. And then finally, we have some that are very, very tall. They have a very tall, upright growth habit. And you can see in the rubber plant in the right hand one, that's going to be your taller plant. It's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. And the stocky white flowers in the left hand photo, they have that tall, upright growth habit. They give you a lot of height. And this is why we don't want that tall, upright plant in our hanging basket. We want the mounding and the trailing, because we want to, in your hanging baskets, you want to have a defined shape, and then you want the plants to kind of come down to your audience. You want them to reach out. You don't want them to keep going up higher and higher and higher and seem unreachable, if that makes sense. There's also texture. So different plants with different leaves and flowers are going to have different textures. They can be fine, they can be medium, they can be coarse. So when we look at the arrangement on the right, it's just in one, I believe it's actually a plastic pot. We can see at least 3 different textures here. So we have a fern-like plant. It almost looks like dill or fennel. It's not either one of those, but it has kind of that look to it, that very, very fine leaf. That's a fine texture. This is a really great way to fill space. But if you use too many fine textured plants at one time, it looks a little bit too busy. You can also have kind of a sharp texture. So that grass that's being used as our kind of a central plant, giving us our height element, it's very sharp. But that's contrasted by one of our edge plants in the bottom right with those big round heart-shaped leaves. That's kind of a coarser texture. It's a bigger, bolder statement. So that's the difference between fine, medium, and coarse. And then, you have your sharp grass-like or palm-like leaves. And then you can also have leaves that are serrated. They can also, so the edges are almost toothed. And then you have some leaves that are fuzzy, like lamb's ear or sage. So there's a lot of different ways to incorporate different types of texture. So you can see here, that's the grass and the palms that I was pointing out. They have that sharp texture contrasted by the rounder textures. And then, having the Coleus, which is a nice mix of the two, where that green arrow is. You're going to hear me talk a lot about Coleus. It's a great beginner plant, and it has a wide variety of color, which is why we focus so much on it. So we've talked specifically about the individual plants, but now let's talk about the overall feel you want to give with your container. And a really important concept to consider is rhythm. So the rhythm of your planting is kind of what the eyes encounter as they move around, because as you look at a container garden, you're not just going to look at one flower and then go away. That's not what you want. You want people to continuously appreciate it. And as the eye kind of trails around the plants, you want it to do so in a logical way. So here we've got some zinnia and some daisies in the lower left, that nice bright orangey color. And it's flanked by these deep violet coral bells that really help to ground it. And no matter what I see kind of as I go around looking at that container, I can kind of come back to these coral bells as my eyes look up around that height element, go back to the orange of the zinnia, and then some little purple milkweed or possibly a type of lobelia there. And then it sees the coral bells again. It just kind of grounds the eye and the overall feel of it. And then again, on the right is almost a literal translation of that concept. You have just repeated elements. You have a lot of different colors, you have a lot of different textures, but you have a core idea that is repeated and repeated and repeated. So that really dynamically fills the space. Your eyes don't get bored, but it really naturally, you find yourself following it along and following it along all the way to the end. So that's what we mean by rhythm with our plantings, kind of how it directs you. Then there's also finally proportion. So proportion is really important. So not only, it keeps us on track with making sure our garden looks nice, but also it can help manage our space wisely. You don't want a bunch of plants growing taller than your actual container. The rule of thumb is that you don't want your planting to exceed 2/3 of the height of your container. So on the right here, this is kind of a standard container garden. You'll see this garden used a couple of times because it's just a really great example. Got a lot of different shots of it. So we've got that tall kind of Coleus, that purple in the middle, adding our height element. We've got a bunch of other different plants, and all the leaves are roughly the same size or a little bit smaller. You don't have anything fern-like. You don't have anything really, really tiny. Because in your medium to larger containers, you want to maintain that boldness. You want it to look like the leaves are supposed to be there. And if you have a bunch of really, really tiny flowers in this container, it's not going to look as cohesive. So stick to kind of medium, coarser textures with your larger containers. And then on the left, with your smaller containers, you can do that finer texture, that medium texture. And I like this example too, because it's a great example of symmetry and rhythm. And because you can see that grass is your central height element, it kind of divides the planting, but it's very comfortable. You see the same thing on both sides, very symmetrical. If you cut it in half, it's identical. We have some stone crop kind of coming over the edge. We've got some daisies just to add some interest. We've got medium and fine textures. It's just a really great example of several different design principles executed pretty well. Now, a lot of people have heard of a color wheel. This is specifically a flower color wheel, and they are different in that the flower color wheel, the words on here are chosen very specifically because a lot of the plants that you see with different color variations, their names and their cultivars or varieties are going to be derived from this wheel. So it will very seldom be a forest green or an army green coral bell. It'll be an olive green coral bell. If you have something of a deeper blue, it'll be a midnight blue, not necessarily a navy blue or something like that. They pretty consistently use these colors, and they're a really great way to kind of figure out what works well together also. So again, continuing with the artsiness of this, we need to have kind of basic understanding of color theory. So we've talked about overall kind of physical properties of our plants. Now let's focus in on actual color, because I know that's what a lot of us are interested in. And something I want y'all to note, we talk about it a little bit later, but look how many flowers there are not in these plantings. You can achieve a lot of different textures and a lot of different beautiful color schemes with only foliage. So I just want y'all to kind of take that away. You don't necessarily need flowers for a really successful container garden, especially if you're in the shade. A lot of flowers don't do well in the shade, like on my porch. So you have to make do with really colorful foliage like this. So with color echoing, that's the first thing we're going to talk about. That is the use of the same color, but in different ways throughout the planting. So up here on the right, we've got a couple different varieties of Coleus here. One is kind of raggedy, and it has that purple, that nice deep purple color with kind of bright green edges. And that purple color is brought into the other plant by just being a subtle touch on the inside of that leaf. So that's color echoing. It's not a leaf that looks identical, but it provides some cohesiveness to the planting by having this color kind of accented around. Same on the left-hand side, we have those variegated geraniums, and they have kind of that tan on the outer left that's mimicked in the impatiens flower there. It looks a little bit more bright white. But it just helps kind of tie everything together by having each of the plants give little nods to each other. And then there's also harmonies within color theory. The first one is monochromatic. So this is where you only use one color, but you vary the lightness and the darkness. Obviously, there are going to be little exceptions to them, like the small little flowers aren't all the same colors. But in the left, this is very obviously a purple monochrome. So we have that tall purple grass. We have the ornamental potato leaves that are like a nice kind of deep purple. We have kind of that purple reflected in the flower throats. We also have another type of purple flower, and then kind of a blue violet flower adding some more height as well. So that blue violet or that deep violet is our selected color here. Same on the right, we're kind of going with a mint green or an olivey green of varying intensities. And you can see there's both cool greens and warm greens, but either way, we're focusing on green foliage in this, this example. So typically a monochromatic planting is going to be a little bit more soothing. There's nothing really surprising about it. A lot of times it'll just be to fill space in a planting sometimes, or in a landscape rather. You have a lot of bold hydrangeas or roses or something, and you just need to kind of fill space, but you don't want to distract. Monochromatic harmonies are the way to go. You can also use analogous harmonies. So when we think about the color wheel, these are all going to be colors that are closely related to each other. This is a great way to create mood. When we see a lot of blues and purples, we feel cool, we feel calm. When we see a lot of reds and oranges, we feel warm and energized. So that's what I mean by creating mood. This is also good to know depending on what pollinators you want to attract. So hummingbirds love red, bees love whites, pinks, and violets. Butterflies love reds and violets as well. That's a whole other talk, but this analogous colors are a great way to make a certain type of pollinator garden as well. So here we see lantana, we see some bright zinnia. These colors are all closely related to each other, and they're all very warm. Even the green foliage you see here is a warm green. It's a yellowish green, not a blue green for the most part. So it's really maintaining that theme. And you get a little bit more dramatic than your monochromatic. This is more of a statement piece when you're doing analogous colors. Same for complementary colors. So complementary colors are colors that are directly on the opposite side of each other. So here we have a lot of good examples with that. So the Coleus in the lower left, Coleus is really great at having variegated cultivars with colors at the opposite ends. So here we have like a lime green, almost a yellow leaf with purple venation. It's very bold, very high contrast. And then we've got some spurges and things like that, like in this picture. The flowers themselves have complementary colors built in. And then the arrangement on the right, you have that bright orange and you have the yellows contrasting with those deep purples. And then you also have some kind of neutral pale yellow tones and white tones as well to help kind of balance everything out. So not everything is screaming at you, but it's a really great way to create a container that demands attention. This is a centerpiece. This is a focal point in a garden. And it's also going to demand pollinator attention too. And then finally, well, I think we have one more after this, but neutral is also important. And I think it's often underutilized. Never underestimate the power of just a nice neutral white flower, like a cosmos or dusty miller, which is that silvery leaf. You can also do lamb's ear, which is kind of a light, pale, silvery green leaf as well. Some of your ornamental greens, like ornamental cabbages, ornamental kales, come in nice subtle colors as well. So they can be used to help divide bold colors. So if you have a planting like the one before that we saw, with a lot of purples and a lot of oranges, planting something neutral in between helps give the eyes a break. And it can kind of divide things up if the colors are too strong. Then finally, we have polychromatic. When in doubt, just put all the colors you like. There's no wrong way to really do this. And we like polychromatic too because it most mimics the way flowers are found in nature. If you think of a wildflower meadow, or, you know, just kind of the forest floor at a park or something. You're not going to see the same color planted in groups unless it's part of their landscaping crew doing that. They're going to have all sorts of different colors mixed together. And for the most part, their textures and colors, especially if you pick native species, are going to blend really well. So don't be afraid to just put all the colors in there as well. But I think if you're doing that and you're doing a lot of color, focus, just go big or go home, make it all about the flowers. Don't put a lot of different colors, but then try to break them up with a lot of foliage. If you're gonna go for a natural meadow-like setting, make it all about the wildflowers. So that is our design theory. And I know I threw a lot at you. It felt kind of like an art class, but now we actually have some tips for how to plant your container gardens. You're going to want to choose at least 3 textures to make your container garden interesting. So obviously you're going to want kind of a medium-sized pot or a larger, you know, 1 gallon or larger usually does very well. And you want to pick things that, you know, the colors kind of go together, but the textures are significantly different. So here, there's another example of that Coleus in the upper left, that purple and green, very, very nice, cool, calming color combination. The purple is echoed beneath it, and the green is echoed beside it with that grass. So there's a lot of different options and ways that you can do this. If it were just the 2 of them, yeah, it would be fine, but to really amp it up and make it look like a really nice art piece or container piece, we recommend at least 3 different textures. You don't need to go above 4 or 5, then it'll look a little too busy, but just something to think about. So here, like I mentioned before, we've got those 3 different textures and those 3 different plants. And then on the right, they're kind of similarly mimicked with the sweet potato trailing down, and then you have the sharp purple leaves, and then the very, very rounded begonia leaves. Also use, and I mentioned this before earlier, use plenty of plants that are foliage plants. You can have a beautiful container garden without a single flower. If you just take into account the color, the leaf shape, and the texture. Also, something important to know with certain plants, the light exposure is going to affect their coloration. So try to look on the label or look up the plant beforehand to make sure that if you are buying a plant that's part shade, the part shade plants are the ones that you'll really, really see this in. The more sunlight you have, oftentimes the more vibrant it is. The less sunlight, the less vibrant it is. You'll still see it's true to form in that it will be a type of purple and green or a type of green and blue, but the vibrance of those colors may depend on the amount of sunlight you get. So just something to know. And then here, yes, all foliage. We've got a big begonia leaf in the lower left. We've got that fine texture up front or up at the top. And then we've got a palm, and then in the right, similar idea with the green grass and the fine texture and the trailing ivy as well. Lots of different leaf shapes, lots of different texture, but it all kind of goes together. Also take into account the actual look of the leaves beyond just how big they are or the shape. What is the actual texture of them? Leaves like Coleus and lamb's ear, they're fuzzy. So they're not gonna reflect back a lot of light, whereas your spurges, your ivies, they're gonna be a little waxier and they're gonna be shinier. So that's another way you can create a little bit more interest, is by having those types of different textures and having light bouncing from different sources. And then you can have something nice and medium in the lower right, like that sweet potato leaf. It's, you know, kind of like a basil leaf where it looks a little bit shiny, but it's not reflective. It doesn't look quite as waxy as a spurge leaf or like a succulent leaf. Here's just an example of those 2 different textures. You can really see how shiny the ivy is in this picture versus the hairier Coleus. And again, I can't say enough good things about Coleus. It comes in so many different cultivars with different shaped leaves, different colors, different sizes. It's a great way to echo colors in your container. So definitely stick to that color echoing. Try to vary the shape and flowers, the shape of the flowers and the size of the flowers in your container. That's going to add a lot of interest. So if you go with a petunia, like on the upper left, petunia have a lot of different color variations. My favorite is called the galaxy petunia, just how they get the little spots to look like stars, and it's almost black. It's so purple, it's almost black. So you can get a lot of different really cool varieties. There's also a red and white stripe, the carnival petunia. There's the purple and white. You can get a lot of variation with just one type of plant. But at the same time, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want just a whole container of different colors of petunias. To add a little bit more interest, you may want to add a verbena in the lower left. So you're still kind of echoing that color scheme. You're echoing the overall look of that flower. They're both very rounded, kind of umbrella shaped, but verbena is made up of smaller flowers. So it has a little bit of a different texture, and it's going to trail. It has a different growth habit as well, as opposed to petunias, which you can keep a little bit more mounded. Petunias can also trail if you let them grow. And then also there's a lot of different bicolor flowers. So lantana is a great option. It has a lot of different colors within one flower head. And then you've got a lot of other options in salvia and violas and things like that as well. They have multiple colors to provide some interest. So vegetative annuals mix well with other annuals. When we say vegetative annuals, it means they're not very woody. And they just grow. They don't necessarily flower. They're primarily foliage. They pretty much mix well with everything. They're pretty neutral. Whether you have perennials or tropical plants or bulbs, they're just really great filler plants. And you can see, once again on the left, there's that Coleus. Now, when we talk about positioning the plants, positioning is key. So you can get a perfect, upright, grassy plant to give you that sharp texture you want, but if you just put it off to the side, it's not really going to have the impact that you want, maybe. So it's important to figure out what plants you want in which position, and there's 4 main positions in an ornamental container garden: center, filler, corner, and edge. Okay, so your center plants are going to be those showstoppers, the really height-inducing ones. They have a tall, upright growth habit. They are pretty compact. So they're usually a little bit sharper, but they're going to fill in the crown of that container and set that 2/3 height requirement that you need. You're also going to have filler plants, which are also compact. They can also be upright. Typically they're mounding, and they round out that top of the container. They set that horizon, like I mentioned before. You can have corner plants that grow well over the container's edge, as well as so they don't necessarily trail over the edge, but they grow out over it. So they kind of expand the reach of the container, if that makes sense. And then your edge plants are the ones that are typically trailing and actually drape over the side. They can camouflage any lining that you may have or any blemishes on your container and add to kind of an asymmetry of the container if you want. They're just really good about filling out space and softening the look of the container. So some great center plants are going to be salvia on the left, that nice bright red character. They also make some white and some blue varieties. Coleus, of course, Persian shield, and some other different perennials. We could go on and on about the center plants. Filler plants, I tend to be a little bit more creative with these. You can have a little bit more variegation, a finer texture. This is where you want to fill in space and create interest where there is none. So geraniums work really well. Smaller, more compact varieties of Coleus are good. Dusty Miller is good, especially if you need a neutral element and you have a lot more boldness going on in your center and your edge plants. So things like that are some things to consider for fillers. For corner plants, petunias work really well. Fuchsias are great. They are that bright pink, bright purple bell shaped. They're a very, very unique looking flower. Begonias, all sorts of different things that can kind of fill in and either grow upwards or kind of soften the edge of your planting. And then for the actual edge plants themselves, verbena is a great one. Verbena can be a good filler plant as well because it can grow a little bit more upright depending on how you train it, or it can grow out and over. But that verbena is that purple cluster flower kind of in the center there. It's that number 3. Ivy is a really great example of an edge plant. It always grows out and over. The different ornamental thymes do really well, or just regular thyme, grow very, very viney, trails a lot, things like that. So ivy geraniums too are trailing. And then also sweet potato vines. There are ornamental sweet potato vines, or you can just plant a little potato in your container garden and have it vine out and add some interest that way. And if you don't know where to start, if you're like, Melissa, you're throwing all these colors and these theories our way, like how do we actually know what to pick? Just pick a theme. If you like ferns, okay, I know I'm gonna look for ferns. And I'm gonna see what colors there are, what textures there are, and everything's gonna be a fern, or everything's gonna be a succulent. Everything's gonna be a bulb. Everything's going to be an herb. Pick a theme for your garden if you're having trouble really honing in, and if you don't know that much about ornamental container gardening. This can really help to direct you. And also it's going to be a little bit more obvious to your observer what your theme is too, because most of us know what a fern is. And it's another great way to make sure that all the plants in your container have the same moisture and fertilization and shade requirements as well by picking that theme. You're a lot less likely to go astray if you pick all ferns, because there are not very many sun-loving ferns. There are not very many water-loving succulents. So that's a good way to make sure that they're all kind of across the board, the same care requirements. So this is going to be a basic overview of some things we've already talked about. We've talked about choosing containers in other webinars, but for those who haven't been able to join, here's a refresher. There's a lot of variety. Really just pick what you like. You can get a basket, you can get something that hangs on the wall, you can get a window box, wooden baskets, terracotta, any type of container that you want. Just depending on which one you choose may take a little bit of different requirements for setup. So if you get something like a wire basket, moss or coco fiber baskets and liners are great ways to go. There's no difference between them and a plastic basket. Absolutely none, as far as quality. Now, you may need to maintain them different ways, but they're both equally well as far as plant performance is concerned. Now, especially if you get a wooden container, you're gonna want a lining. And here's a couple of different examples of those. Moss is gonna be great. It looks pretty natural. You can plant very easily through it. So a lot of these, if you have kind of a container that has different levels and things kind of peek out a little bit, you're going to want the roots to be able to go through them. And then you can also put a plastic liner within the moss to further protect your container. Coconut fiber liners are also very great. They're very natural looking, they have kind of a woollier texture, and they're very durable. They can last several seasons, sometimes a year or two. You can also get biodegradable liners. These are made from more compressed fibers, and they'll last you usually 2 years. Sometimes you'll get 3 or 4 out of them. It depends on what types of plants, what the conditions are, and things like that. And you're gonna want to make holes in the sides and the base for the trailing plants. Sometimes plants will actually kind of poke out a little bit if you have those liners. So you wanna make sure they're able to do so. And then if you just use plastic, it's cheap, it's available, but you're gonna wanna pierce some holes and it's not really that attractive. So try to get plants that are gonna trellis over it and camouflage it a little bit. What soils to use? Slow release. So get potting soil that has a slow release fertilizer in it. It's gonna be well drained, have good aeration, but also retain enough water. So you don't want to use pure compost. You don't want to use pure sand or gravel or anything like that. That's not going to hold enough water. So if you do use moss or coco fiber baskets, this is where I was talking about the maintenance may be a little bit different. They're a lot more open to the air. And so if you have a really water loving plant that loves wet feet and needs a lot of water, consider adding a water retaining agent to the soil mix. This is a polymer. It's kind of a similar idea if you've ever had cricket food, or if you've ever cut open a diaper, an unused diaper. It's an absorbent polymer that holds that water in place. And instead of just holding it there and not letting it go anywhere, it'll hold the water that you put into it and then slowly release it over time as that soil dries out. So that's what a water retaining agent does. And they're just called water retaining agents. There's no special name for it. There may be different brands, but look for those specific terms if you have those types of plants. And when you're choosing a location, always keep in mind how much sunlight you have. This seems pretty straightforward, but try to actually look at it throughout the day and throughout the seasons and take note. If you have 8 to 12 hours of sun per day, you're going to want plants that are full sun or part shade. If you only have 4 to 8 hours of sunlight, you're going to want partial shade for the most part. Some full sun plants can handle less than 8 hours. But you'll definitely want partial shade at least to make sure they all perform well. If you only receive 2 to 4 hours of light a day, you're going to want partial to full shade plants. Full sun cannot handle that, and your shade plants cannot handle 8 to 12 hours of sun. So sunlight is a really important thing to know as far as the exposure of where you want your container garden to go. So I mentioned this before with our theme gardens, but number one rule, all plants combined in one container should have similar water, light, and fertilizer requirements. You do not want to plant an echinacea or a coneflower that's full sun in the same container that a fern is, because that fern needs shade and that echinacea needs full sun. Their water requirements are different. They will not work well, and you cannot keep fighting against it. So plant like plants with like as far as their requirements. So just another visual to help us kind of understand trailing and mounding in our baskets. We typically recommend using odd numbers of plants per container. So again, it may depend on container size and the overall feel that you're looking for, but if you think about a basket that's going to be hanging, it may turn, you're going to be going like kind of moving all around it. So having that symmetry, it's a lot easier to have a similar view from all sides if you use odd numbers of your trailing and mounding pieces. This is just a final example of a planted container garden. So in the middle, you can see that really pretty blue focal point. That is our center plant. It is compact. It's not sprawling everywhere. It is upright. It adds height. And then you can see our filler plants to the right of it, and our edge plants and our corner plants. So this is a freshly planted one, so you don't see the trailing aspect as much over the edge, but as it grows, you will see it morph. Here's a great example of how you can apply these principles with herbs. So what do we see here? We see a lot of different textures. We see different colors. We see a little bit of asymmetrical balance here. We see our edge plants. We see our center plants. That mint is going right in the center. And then we see that purple from that Thai basil. We see chives adding a sharper, finer element to it. So again, there's a bunch of different ways you can get really creative, even with edible plants. You don't necessarily need to stick one herb to one container. You can kind of freestyle it and see what does well also. So for maintaining your container garden, probably the number one thing to consider, aside from the sun exposure where you put it, is watering. Your containers are going to need watered a lot more than your in-ground plants will, because especially your baskets, because they're going to be more exposed to air. There's a lot more air movement around them, especially in your moss and coco baskets, which means there's going to be more evaporation of that water. It's going to be harder for those plants to hold on to it. So you're going to need to water it more often than maybe a large concrete or wine barrel container as well. Clay containers like terracotta can also dry out a lot faster. So if you have water-loving plants in there, use a water retaining agent like I mentioned. When you can use a hose, it's just easier if you have an outdoor water hookup. And always make sure it has an adjustable spray nozzle. This is because if you just use a hose without a nozzle on it, it may end up flooding your plants, it'll displace the soil. And if you just have one with the nozzle, they just, you just push the lever and it shoots right out like you're washing a car with or something, that will slice right through the roots. It's almost like a pressure washer. It can disturb the soil, can knock things out. It's very hard on the plants. You want one of those more rounded nozzles that you can select, a stream or a jet or, kind of a rain mimic, because you want to make sure that you're equally and gently distributing that water across the root system without injuring or stressing that plant. You also don't want water on the foliage. So if you don't have a hose, a way that you can mimic this is by getting a watering can with a removable tip. So you'll see, we all know kind of the watering can shapes. They have a spout covering on the end that can make it like a little rain shower. Or you can take that off and it's just a spout, so you can very gently give increased levels of water that way. So also, final idea, if your basket is on a pulley system, some people kind of have a hook and have it attached to twine so they can pull it up or lower it. Also great if your sunlight changes throughout the year and you have perennial plants, something to think about. Be wearisome of squirrels. Be wary of squirrels. They will chew through that twine, so maybe have something a little bit, maybe more like a wire cable or something, if you want to do this system. But if you can lower that basket and it's not too big, you can actually just soak it in a bowl of water and that soil will sap up all the water. Leave it in there for, a couple minutes. Don't leave it more than an hour. You don't want to drown the roots. But then when you pull it up, it's going to have all the extra water drain back into that bowl. Fertilizing, you'll hear me talk a little bit more about fertilizing ornamental plants than our herbs and vegetables, because a lot of these are going to be perennials and they're going to be a little bit more crowded. They may be a little bit more stressed. But you will want to regularly feed these so everybody has enough resources. Always use slow release pellets, like Osmocote is a really great option. There are other varieties, Bonine makes some. I mean, everybody makes slow release plant food or fertilizer. And you want to follow the label instructions always, or you can get the liquid forms. Miracle Grow does have some liquid options as well. That you can either mix it in with the water or you just pour it over itself. Do not use regular granular fertilizers that come in the big old bags. Don't use those. Those are meant for in-ground plants that are more mature to handle it. And do not use weed and feed formulations either, because weed and feed, as its name implies, weeds, so it has an herbicide in there and it feeds. So that herbicide can really have potential to damage your plants. As far as maintaining the general appearance, nothing lasts forever. Your plants are going to grow and they're going to change. And your container gardens, as their name implies, need to be gardened. They are a garden. So just like you would get out in an in-ground garden on your hands and knees and weed and deadhead the flowers, your container garden is going to need that same attention, just maybe not to the same extent because it's a smaller space. So your plants are going to need trimming. They're going to need maintenance. They're going to need pruning. You're going to need to deadhead your flowers so that when the flowers bloom out and they have their seed heads, this is a really great time to save your seeds. So you'll clip off the bloom, and then that's going to encourage the plant to provide more flowers as well. You will probably need to spray for some sort of pests or diseases. but you can stay as natural as you want. If you just have something like aphids, soapy water will get them right off. If you do apply something like neem oil, neem is toxic to bees, so you're going to want to do it in the evening. So even though it's organic, it's broad spectrum. So anytime you apply something for pests and diseases, do it in the evening or early morning before anybody wakes up. You will probably have some weed control. There are seeds that travel on the air. You may have birds visiting or squirrels visiting your container gardening and drop seeds and berries in there. Something may sprout up. It's not going to be to the same extent as in the ground, but be on the lookout for it. And then replacement. You may get tired of a plant. It may not perform well in the container you have. It may be an annual and be spent by the end of the year. It may have a disease and you just need to remove it and replace it with something hardier, but you will eventually need to replace plants. So here's just a good example of the life of a container garden. So I showed you this one earlier. This is just a good standard container garden. This is when it's freshly planted. And then we've got a couple months later in the heat of summer, you can see the Coleus is really fleshed out. The colors have kind of changed with those potato leaves. And then finally, now we're getting to the point where we almost need to prune it back a little bit because we can't even really see the container anymore. So we're going to need to take back some of those Coleus branches. We're going to need to clip off some of those flowers that are spent and things like that. And then most of all, don't forget to have fun. Nobody's going to come up to your container garden and say, that looks horrible. How could you have even put those flowers together? Nobody's going to say that. This is for you to express what you like. It's to create something that is enjoyable for you to look at, for you to share with the people that you love, and to provide a haven for pollinators. So that all sorts of different things that you can gain from this. So don't worry about doing anything wrong. I just taught you the basics. And like I said, there's not really a wrong way to do art. Art is a form of expression. So unless you put a fern in full sun, you're not really doing anything wrong. So just don't be afraid to really get creative and experiment. So that's all I had for the actual presentation. So right now, we're going to try to tackle these questions. I'm going to stop my screen sharing right now if my mouse wakes up so you can actually see me. We do have some questions. Do we have that survey? Now that I have y'all's attention and we've got almost 200 participants, that's awesome. I'm going to go ahead and share that survey link. And if Ashley, if you can kind of help me throw some questions at me while I'm doing that.
No problem. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. Yeah.
Okay. So the very first one is about hydrangeas. So you mentioned growing hydrangeas in a container. How can you do so successfully?
Yeah, I would plant a hydrangea and only a hydrangea in there. When you get, and also hydrangeas are very pH sensitive as well. So knowing the variety of hydrangea that you have and the requirements for it, part shade is going to be very successful with hydrangeas. They're going to love that. Excellent drainage, and you may need some sort of soil pH modification. They are kind of trickier to grow in containers, but I've seen a lot of people have a lot of success. Again, tons of different varieties. Some do better in containers than others. So do your research with that, but I'd say definitely drainage, soil pH, and just don't plant anything else with them. Get a nice big container, like a big wine barrel, a huge concrete container. You're not going to be moving them very much, so get something that just kind of hangs out. And make sure they have enough room to grow, and check on them every couple of years because they do like to be in the ground and they can grow very large. So you may need to do some root pruning as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about companion planting? What does well together?
Okay, so I'm not as familiar with companion planting with ornamentals because you don't necessarily have the same pest problems, but petunias and Geraniums and marigolds are all very, very traditional companion plants. I would say definitely stick to annuals, which most companion plants are, and see what does well. The science behind companion planting is not readily established. So it's hard to know necessarily that this one species is going to go great with this other species. As more of a general rule, we have, you know, certain types of companion plants, like I just mentioned, the marigolds, especially, everybody knows about marigolds. You know, some herbs can be considered companion plants because anecdotally, you know, deer don't really bother rosemary as much. So you can plant rosemary around your hostas. But as far as ornamental container gardening, I don't know that we have a lot of good information about that.
Okay, great. So a few people have mentioned using disposable diapers in hanging baskets. Can you comment on this?
I bet that's for the same reason I mentioned that water retaining agent. It is, I don't really recommend using the diapers. I feel like the water retaining agent is gonna be cheaper, and especially now that we're having a harder time finding household items, I would say leave the diapers for the babies. But that water retaining agent is a very similar, if not the same polymer. So when you put that water retaining agent with that soil, as you water it, it soaks it up. And it's actually meant and designed to be in a container garden. So yeah, I wouldn't really recommend using the disposable diapers in there. Just use what's actually meant to be used in there.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. The next question is, can you give us some ideas on center plants that thrive in direct sun?
Center plants, that Coleus #1 really, really does well. It gets really vibrant colors, just like I talked about. Salvias are really great. There's a lot of diversity with salvias. I'm coming at this from a beginner perspective too. They're just really great. And a lot of them are annuals. You can get some perennial salvia. A lot of the ornamental salvias I see don't do very well year to year in containers. So they may act as annuals. But the salvia, it's very tall. It's got very tubular flowers, and it's got a lot of foliage as well, but it's very compact, very upright, and very hard to kill. Not many pests like it. And you won't need to trim it back as much as you would certain Coleus varieties. Hummingbirds love it, pollinators love it. So those are going to be like my two top recommendations. I could go on and on about different plants, and we'll provide some resources about that. But if you're just looking for ideas about that, I think that would be a good one.
Okay. Next question. When you need to replace a plant, do you have any tips on removing and replanting so not to damage the other plants in the container?
Yeah, so if you need to remove a dead or spent plant or diseased plant, definitely take out as much of the plant material as possible. You may pull it and just the foliage comes out. Try to get that root ball as well. If you're removing a plant because you don't like it and it's perfectly healthy and you just want to put it somewhere else, typically the root ball will come right with it if you kind of dig around it and pull it out. But you don't want to just yank it out like a weed. You want to be careful with it, almost like because you are probably going to transplant it. But my recommendation would definitely be get the root ball out and maybe get some extra soil out too, to leave plenty of space for a new plant if you're going to put one in there. And then when you do add a new plant back into that space, maybe put some fresh soil in with it with a slow release fertilizer.
Okay. Speaking of fertilizer, can you explain a little bit more what a granular fertilizer formulation is?
Yeah, granular is just like little grains. So it's like what people put in rotary spreaders and spread out on their lawns. You water it in and the chemicals are pretty much immediately available. And oftentimes they're a little bit more jagged. I'm trying to think of something like coarse salt would be, or kitty litter. It's like the consistency of kitty litter. Kitty litter is granular. But so your granular fertilizers are going to have that. They also produce a bit more dust when you apply them too. And that the granular fertilizers are typically what you'll see when you see those big bags of like 10, 10, 10 or 30, 30, 30, or something like that in a feed store or at Home Depot. But what you want it specifically labeled as slow release. And those will usually be more like pellets because they're going to be coated and they're going to slowly release their fertilizer over time, which is what you want in a container, because you don't want to keep applying that fertilizer, because if you apply a granular fertilizer that just gives you everything up front immediately, you could lead to burns in your plants. Could have nitrogen burns, could have too much phosphorus, things like that. That slow release is going to allow for a much more uniform distribution that is appropriate for the size of your container. It's going to prevent salt buildup. It's going to prevent burns. So that's what I mean between granular and slow release. It's kind of a textural thing, but it's mainly going to be on the label. Don't get standard granular, get slow release.
Okay. Another question is morning sun better or afternoon sun for partial sun requirements?
It could actually depend on the plant, because I know coral bells, some people say that they do better with some morning sun because it's not going to be as hot. Because some of these shady plants or plants that are partial shade can handle full sun, but they can't handle heat. And they especially can't handle them both at the same time. So for your full sun plants that are sun-loving plants, afternoon sun is going to be great. They can typically handle that heat as long as they're watered. They get longer sun in the afternoon. The morning sun is better for if you have like something that's on the border where it can't have sun all day and it can't handle heat, but you happen to have some sun over here. So you have to choose, put it where it gets morning sun. Morning sun is just a little bit gentler. It can evaporate the dew off of leaves without giving too much sunburn. And again, you don't have the added heat stress as well. So if you have full sun plants, don't worry about morning versus afternoon. It's really if you have part shade or shade plants that you need to worry about morning versus afternoon sun. So if they get a little bit of morning sun, that's fine. They get more afternoon sun, that's not as good.
Okay. And there's several questions or comments about ornamental grasses in containers. Do you have any recommendations on ones that do well or growing them in containers?
Specific species, I have a lot of grass examples, but I'm going to be honest, I don't have too many off the top of my head. I'm just absolutely blanking on it right now. I wouldn't say things like Liripe or anything. Those do a lot better as kind of in the ground. But they have some grass, like little blue stem is a native one that may do well. A lot of just your ornamental grasses if you go to Pikes or a local nursery, and any grass that's outside but in kind of a smaller container should work pretty well. That is something I need to look up, and we'll address that in the Q&A report after, for sure. I'm going to be straight with you. I need to look that up.
Okay, no, that is fine. Another question is, what kind of soap can you use for aphids?
Just Dawn and water, Dawn dish soap, whatever type of dish soap. I would not use things with a fragrance just because it's an added chemical that you don't need. But yeah, for aphids, just make a mix of soapy water with some sort of gentle dishwashing water, or dishwashing soap and water, and you can put it in a little spray thing, just a little spray bottle, and then spray it on usually you'll see them on the undersides of leaves. So don't forget to spray the undersides of the leaves. Again, I would optimally do this actually in the morning because you don't want damp foliage going into the evening if you're just using water. If you're using something like oil, that's different. It won't really facilitate fungal growth, but yeah, if you're spraying them, I would recommend doing it more in the morning so it has a chance to dry out, but don't do it middle of the day because then your leaves will get sunburned. So yeah, just Dawn or some other dish soap would be fine.
Okay, great. And can you speak a little bit about using potato vines in containers? And is this the same potato vine that we use for potato food crops?
Yeah, so there are specific ornamental varieties. So I don't know if you saw the one that had almost like a turkey foot leaf. There are some with like a really pretty lime green, a really pretty purple. Those are all specifically ornamental varieties. But you can also get the same effect by just lumping off a piece of sweet potato that sprouts and throwing it in there. Now, those are sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes and potatoes are not the same. Potatoes are a nightshade, and sweet potatoes are more closely related to morning glories. A lot of people don't realize that. You can eat sweet potato leaves. You should not eat potato leaves. So, and your sweet potatoes are going to have that trailing habit. So you can get either ornamental varieties, which are usually transplanted, ready to go, put them right in the container. They just kind of take off. Or if you want to experiment with cutting a sweet potato in half and putting it in a container and seeing how it trails over, you can do that too. It's just a very standard dark green color.
Okay, awesome. And then do you have any recommendations for controlling ants in containers?
Oh, controlling ants in containers. Yeah, that's kind of tough because number one, I'd say look for an aphid problem, because ants can come to your container when they know aphids are there. Aphids secrete something called honeydew. It's a very, very sweet waste, and your ants will usually farm them for this. So number one, look for an aphid problem. Number two, you can kind of create a makeshift ant moat. And what that is, I don't know if any of you have had hummingbird feeders with an ant moat, but it's like its name implies, it's a defensive moat. So you can have a container and then a larger saucer under it and keep water in it. And the ants, a sensible amount of water, maybe an inch or two, have it a deeper saucer. But also have like some sort of barrier in your pot, because you don't want the actual, or have the pot raised up on like one of those shelf organizers. So it's not sitting in the water, because that can damage your plant roots. But basically the ants will not be able to, they're not going to want to go across that water to get to your plants. They may drink the water at the edge, but that's kind of the purpose of an ant moat. They'll fall into it, especially if you use soapy water. But there's also boric acid. If you're having a problem with it, boric acid or borax can be, put it around your porch. I don't recommend just throwing it out into the environment, but, putting a perimeter of it around, things like that. But yeah, just ants are very difficult. So just try to disrupt their trails as best you can.
All right, thanks. And then one last question. Is there something safe to put on or around the plants to keep pets away?
To keep pets away. Pets or pests?
Pets. Sorry, P-E-T-S.
Oh, P-E-T-S. Yes. So chemically, no, I wouldn't really recommend anything. I mean, if you want to teach your dog a lesson, some red pepper. That's what we recommend for squirrels too. But as far as something that will not distress your pet or hurt them, I can't really recommend anything. I mean, maybe like a fine mesh if your dog likes to dig in these big containers. Putting like a fine wire mesh over the bottom of it, or I'm going to give a shout out to my mom right now. Actually, she has a bunch of these slate pieces, like tiles, and she's put them in on the top of her container, like where the soil is. Granted, there are not that many plants in these containers, but you put the slate down and they're a lot less likely to dig and move those rock, like flat rock pieces. So that's an option too if digging is an issue. Worst case, just like with any nuisance animal, if your pet is being a nuisance, it needs to be excluded from it. So maybe some sort of kind of fencing or something like that.
Okay, great. And then one last question just came in. Mushrooms have started growing in my container garden. Any ideas on how to get rid of them for good?
That's a moisture issue. It's a moisture and a sunlight issue. I guarantee you, if you don't already, you will probably start to see fungus gnats. So actually the slates that I mentioned can be a great option for that, because mushrooms aren't really going to sprout on those, and it can decrease the amount of surface area that's available for spores to fall on. It really sounds like you have too much moisture in there. That's usually what happens when we see mushrooms popping up. So pull the mushrooms up as soon as you see them. Do not let them go to spore, because that's probably why you're seeing them consistently, because there are spores. Look around your property to see if there are any mushrooms anywhere else. Try to get rid of those as well. And then of course, never eat them. Oh my gosh, never eat them. But it really sounds like a moisture issue to me. Okay, so I think we are butting up to 1:45. So unless there was any other questions that really wanted to be answered live, what we're gonna do is kind of like last week, we're gonna go through the Q&A report and answer each question and send it out for everybody. If that's good with y'all. Do we still have Ashley?
Yeah, I'm still
Okay.
here. I think that would be a great option.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we'll just do the same thing we did last week. Again, got a lot of questions on if it was the previous recordings are available. They are available. They are posted on our YouTube channel, on Fulton County's YouTube channel, as well as Fulton County's Facebook page and our event page that we share with Muskogee County. They're posted several different places. We're gonna do the same thing with this one. This one is actually streaming on Facebook Live right now. So we've got, that'll automatically rip to Facebook, so it'll be available immediately. We may kind of trim things down and make a nicer version to upload to YouTube. That's a little bit more succinct, less technical difficulties at the beginning. But yeah, we will email out an archive link as well, just like last week. Thank you all for the praise. Very nice compliments. Please don't forget to do our Qualtrics. I'm putting that link, that survey, right back in the chat to all panelists and attendees. Please don't forget to do that. This is the last seminar of this series. This is our first time doing anything like this. The response has been amazing. Thank you so much. So we really want to learn from it and grow with it, and any feedback you have is more than welcome. So I think that's pretty much it. Like I said, don't panic if we didn't get to your question. Odds are it will be in the Q&A report that we email out afterwards. Thank you all so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Melissa. Like you said, we are still live over there at Facebook right now. So if you want, go ahead and take a moment and fill out that survey that Melissa has given you, and we'll send that to you as a follow-up as well if you have to run right now. And of course, if you don't already, make certain to go follow both Fulton County and Muskogee County's extension pages on Facebook, where you'll see more programming like this in the future.